Good morning. I am so happy to be virtually here with you all today. It's certainly not the same as attending the ASFPM conference in person, and I'll miss being there with all of you this year. But next best thing is doing this virtually. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes addressing whether or not I see progress being made in Congress on the issue of advancing policies related to climate change and climate resilience in particular. So I'm Sarah Murdock, and I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I work in our government relations department. So most of my time is spent dealing with advancing legislation in Congress, as well as working with federal agencies on the issue of climate resilience. So there's no doubt that a deep political divide does remain on whether or not to act on climate change. Poll after poll shows this divide, particularly between liberals and conservatives. This Pew 2019 poll, which is similar to most, shows the predominant feeling amongst conservative Republicans that policies aimed at reducing the effects of climate change do more harm than good. Whereas moderate Republicans are a little bit more balanced in their response to this question. And moderate liberals, moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats predominantly respond that they see those policies aimed at reducing the impacts of climate change to be predominantly good. And a similar result was appeared when they were asked about policies aimed at reducing the effects of climate change, whether they help or hurt the US economy, with conservatives responding overwhelmingly that such policies hurt the economy. The glimmer of hope comes when looking at the recognition of increased impacts to climate change. So increases in hot weather, more frequent fires, droughts, sea level rise. When asked about this, there is a growing recognition that these impacts are resulting from the effects of climate change. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking first about some of the examples of where I see policy advances being made in Congress, and touch on a few agency-related advances as well. And related to that is also a growing recognition about nature's role in enhancing resilience and reducing impacts from climate change. I'm going to just briefly touch on, there's certainly more work to be done around policies related to climate change. And then I want to finish by talking about some of the strategies and approaches that I think have contributed to advancing some of these policy successes, especially in Congress. So the broad concept of resilience has really grown in acceptance and been embraced, I think, in a very bipartisan way in Congress. Just in the last year, as a lot of debate has gone on related to different forms of infrastructure, and in particular, the Water Resources Development Act and the Transportation Bill, I've witnessed both in the Senate Environment Public Works Committee as well as in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Broad bipartisan support and speaking up about the importance of making resilient investments. I think there's finally an acceptance that it is the prudent thing to do from an economic perspective. And this has really driven quite a few Republicans to embrace this concept. Also growing in acceptance is the role that nature or natural infrastructure, nature-based infrastructure as a form of infrastructure. So when making investments in infrastructure, more and more we're seeing the enabling of consideration of nature as a form of infrastructure investment. The recognition that things like dunes help mitigate flood impacts, that oyster reefs and barrier islands and mangroves, all of these habitat forms provide multiple benefits, but also help mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. So a prime example of what I'm talking about is the current transportation bill that's advanced in the Senate. This bill has unanimously passed the Senate EPW committee, which is led by Chairman Barrasso from Wyoming. And during the markup and hearing to pass the bill out of committee, again, we heard multiple senators from both sides of the aisle speak up about their support for the bill, and in particular, their appreciation for the provisions in the bill addressing resilience. So in the bill, for the first time, is a very robust definition of resilience, as well as natural infrastructure. And those then show up in various places throughout the bill, enabling funding for both resilient infrastructure and natural infrastructure in various programs and provisions throughout the bill. And in particular, there's one new section within the transportation bill called Protect, and it creates a whole new program for specifically funding resilient infrastructure work. This bill just last week was introduced in the House, and we're still looking at that, but also the notion of resilience is featured front and center throughout that bill. Another example of where resilience and natural infrastructure have showed up is in the last year's defense reauthorization bill. In that bill, for the first time, was legislated a flood risk standard for any Department of Defense infrastructure being built. And the flood risk standard took an approach of avoiding disaster where possible, minimizing the risk of flood risk, and mitigating it as a last resort. For the minimize and mitigate risk, infrastructure is now required to have a 2-foot or 3-foot of critical infrastructure base flood elevation when built in 100-year floodplains. There's also a definition of resiliency in that piece of legislation. Also, about a year ago, there was a substantial reauthorization of the Stafford Act. This act is the act that governs disaster process and FEMA's work. And in this, there were several new provisions related to recognizing increased impacts from fires. So fire disaster now eligible for hazard mitigation grant program. And associated with that, the recognition that forest management techniques were eligible as a mitigation activity. So the notion that you can manage and minimize, reduce the risk of extreme forest fire through certain forest management techniques. Importantly, this is the reauthorization that included the new creation of the new BRIC program, the updated pre-disaster mitigation program. With it, they created a substantial amount more funding that will go to the program. Up to 6% of specified portions of disaster relief funds will go to fund this new BRIC program. And that will result in a good 2 to 3, maybe more percent, 2 to 3 times the amount of pre-disaster mitigation funding that we've seen in the past. So a substantial amount more money going into pre-disaster mitigation, recognizing that making these investments will reduce future risk. I think finally Congress is understanding that. And then 2 other programs I'll just mention briefly that have also grown in support over the last couple of years. There's a NOAA Title IX Coastal Resilience Grant Program that's seen increased funds over the last couple of years, and last year received $33 million. And also we've seen increased funding for Army Corps' Continuing Authorities program that deals with enhanced coastal resiliency and stream habitat, receiving $66 million. These are important project-based funding that help invest in resilient-related infrastructure. And then some other places where natural infrastructure in particular has been recognized. I mentioned the Water Resources Development Act. For the last 3 bills, we are now seeing growing emphasis on investments, enabling the investments in natural infrastructure. The 2018 went so far as to mandate that the Corps consider natural infrastructure when making civil works investments. And that trend is continuing in this year's bill as well, where the Senate bill that again has passed in a bipartisan fashion from in the Environment and Public Works Committee is now, it also recognizes natural infrastructure. Also within the Army Corps, there's this program called Engineering with Nature. And that program has done quite a bit to promote investment and use of nature as part of projects. And they've done a lot of training and education internally throughout the Corps, but also externally. Last year, they put out a compendium of case studies, and they are soon to release the 2nd volume of case studies because the first one was so well received. They're also working on some specific guidance for nature-based work that I think will help really educate further the staff throughout the Corps as well as other agencies on how best to incorporate nature when doing various types of projects. Also in FEMA, in their last couple years of pre-disaster mitigation grants, they called out stream restoration as a preferred activity for mitigation. So really recognizing that role that stream restoration can play in reducing flood risk. And then finally, the Federal Highway Administration put out a guidance white paper document called Nature-Based Solution for Coastal Highway Resilience. And if you haven't seen it, I commend you to look at that. It's an excellent document providing a lot of really good detailed information on how to think about incorporating nature into roadway projects or culvert enhancements, various transportation infrastructure types of work. So there's certainly more work that needs to be done to advance policies related to climate resilience and natural infrastructure. There continues to be general attacks on climate science and validity of climate impacts. That's diminished over time, I think, but certainly there's an element of it that still exists. And I mentioned the Defense Reauthorization Act adopting a flood risk standard for DoD, but we desperately need the same type of standard for all federal agencies and federal investment. We had that pass as an executive effort at the end of the last administration, but unfortunately it was repealed at the beginning of this administration. And we continue to need to push for that and really make the argument that it just makes economic sense to build things in a way that will withstand future flood events. And I think we need to still push and advocate to ensure that the full 6% is allocated to the FEMA BRIC program. The legislative language was that the funding could be up to. So I think it requires continued push to ensure that that full 6% is allocated. And also that a disproportionate amount of the funding is not put towards larger gray infrastructure projects that are likely to not be sustainable and resilient over time. And of course, there is tremendous work still to be done related to advancing climate mitigation policy. Again, we've seen some advances, especially more significant corporate voices speaking up for the need to advance policies related to putting a price on carbon. But we're not there yet politically, and there is a lot of work still to be done to ensure that we advance meaningful climate mitigation policy. So let me just finish by touching on a few of the things where I think have strategies and actions that I think have helped advance the policies related to climate resilience and natural infrastructure. In general, I think framing these arguments around economic benefit as well as sensible economic policy and demonstrating the return on investment from these investments, that I think more than anything else has garnered the attention of more conservative members in Congress and has allowed us to get quite a bit of traction and progress made. So these are two studies here that the Nature Conservancy led The first being a study post-Sandy to value the wetlands in place in terms of the damage avoided due to those wetlands being in place. So really putting a value on those wetlands for the flood risk reduction value that they provide. So $625 million in property damage avoided. And the study was done in conjunction with the insurance sector using their insurance models. So again, that probably gave it that added credibility. And that study was peer reviewed and published. And then the other study using similar methodology was done post Irene to look at the value of the mangroves in place in Florida. And those were valued at 1.5 billion in avoided property damage due to the mangroves being in place. And right now, we're really highlighting the economic stimulus value of natural infrastructure and these nature-based restoration kind of projects. This is, you know, right now during these really economically distressed times, this is an opportunity to make the case that this type of work is an important form of economic stimulus that we need to think about to help the economy recover from this COVID-19 crisis and the associated economic downfall. So in 2008, during the previous economic crisis, Congress passed in 2009 the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And NOAA received, I think, around $250 million for restoration work. They did a great job of tracking the job creation stimulus from that and came up with a figure of 15 jobs per million spent and 30 jobs per million spent on more labor-intensive work from that investment that was made. And then finally, I'll end on the power of unusual partnerships, and particularly private sector and nonprofit sector partnerships that help come together and really become a strong voice for advancing these kinds of policies. So we are working in partnership with Caterpillar, AECOM, Great Lakes Dredge and Dock, Brown and Root, Ducks Unlimited, Dawson and Associates, and University of Georgia in a coalition called the Natural Infrastructure Initiative. And the whole purpose behind this initiative is to advance investments in natural infrastructure. And we've done a couple of Hill briefings and other events together, and really showing up as a partnership and as a group garners quite a bit of attention. You know, people always ask Caterpillar, why are they interested in this? Well, doesn't matter if they're turning dirt for a more traditional infrastructure or natural infrastructure. You still need Caterpillar equipment to do that. So it's certainly a business opportunity for them, but they're putting a lot of effort into communicating and supporting this notion of natural infrastructure investments. So with that, I will end, and thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. And very encouraging also, I have to say, in the mitigation world. So we do have a couple of questions from the crowd. One person asks, it seems like we have at least mainstreamed resilience to be understood as bounce back ability. So is the next frontier now bounce forward ability for climate change, equity, et cetera? And can we get there politically?
think we can. Certainly, I think, there is some pretty good acceptance around the notion that we have to incorporate extreme weather and extreme events and climate impact, but not universally yet. So, as I was saying, I think the economic arguments around that, the more that we can frame it around that it makes economic sense, and that we really need to incorporate those extreme impacts, because if we don't, we're likely just to be seeing repeat, building the same infrastructure over and over. And we use culverts a lot as an example for that, because we have lots of examples we can point to that show, having to put in culverts in place 2-3 times after they've been blown out during flood events. And that just doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. So, so I think we can get there, but we need to keep the examples coming in order to make that case.
Okay, that makes sense. And then Anna asks, some people use nature-based solutions and green infrastructure concepts as interchangeable. What is the nuance of this approach in the context of flood risk management?
So there's no uniformly acceptable definition, and there are different terminologies. So Congress has codified natural and nature-based solutions, and I think green infrastructure has also appeared in pieces of legislation. We personally think about natural solutions or natural solutions being a little bit more pure, strictly natural ecosystems performing certain ecosystem services. When you say nature-based, you tend to mean that there might be some gray infrastructure built into that infrastructure. So it's a combination of green and gray infrastructure, usually when you use the term nature-based. And then green infrastructure tends to be more in an urban context. So more techniques that you apply in urban settings that could be addressing water quality as well as flood related impacts. So that's the difference that we see, but there's no uniformly acceptable, definitions that I think everyone has agreed to.
Okay. Another question is, so FEMA has been slow over the decades to embrace natural ecosystem benefits. They had a couple of years ago included some in their benefit loss analysis calculation tool. Do you think that natural ecosystem benefits will rise to a greater significance in some of these benefit cost analyses that we do, especially for floodplain management solutions?
I think there's a lot of work to be done to still fully incorporate the range of ecosystem benefits that we see from natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and it's still very much a challenge. FEMA's done more than say Army Corps in doing that, so I give them credit for that. But I also think there needs to be a little bit more show and tell of how to advance natural infrastructure using FEMA's cost benefit. That there's still challenges there, but I think also we need to just show how to do it so that then we can use those as a good examples that other folks can copy. But I also think we need to work on better quantifying and valuing some of the ecosystem services so they can be incorporated better into the BCA.
Right. And then the last question is, so you mentioned the BRIC program. How do you see legislation that has passed or that's coming up to be passed turning into actual on-the-ground project implementation?
Yeah, so I'll build off what I just said. So I think we really need to work with communities, and Nature Conservancy is starting to do this to really apply good natural infrastructure projects for being awarded funding. And then really break down how to do that, how to get those projects through the cost benefit analysis, how to get those projects accepted for grant awards, and then publicize that so that others can see kind of these examples. So that we really need to document that, and then develop really good case studies that others can look to. I was heartened I was on another session this morning where I think Carrie from FEMA was talking about the BRIC program and talking about they were going to have some case studies on their website. And I thought that was a really good step in the right direction to be able to highlight, project work that does get awarded. But I think we really need to go into the detail to show people how to best do that. And so we're going to be working on that and hopefully publishing some work in about a year or so related to that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. You're very, very knowledgeable, and we're blessed to have you as part of the conference.
Thank you. It was fun.
Okay, so up next is Emily Dhingra. She's a coastal engineer with AECOM, and her session is called Living Shorelines, Where They Make Sense in a Floodplain Management Context. Emily?
Hello, my name is Emily Dhingra. I'm a certified floodplain manager and a coastal engineer with AECOM. I'm glad to be here with you today virtually to talk about living shorelines and floodplain management. Coastal shorelines today and future trends will be a discussion topic we'll start with, and then I'll try and answer the question, why living shorelines? We'll look at some challenges for floodplain management, and then I'll conclude with a discussion of the usefulness of living shorelines and why we should consider them. Shorelines today and in the future. Today we'll be talking about shoreline protection and floodplain management, so I want to start with some common terms. And when I talk about green measures or living shorelines, I'm talking about shoreline habitats and marshes that have been engineered, designed, and constructed to meet a goal such as erosion protection. On the other end of the spectrum are engineered or gray solutions, and that can include riprap and concrete. And then there are things that are in the middle, the hybrid measures. So if you look at the photographs we have in the slides, there's a picture of an Everglades restoration project, something very green. Then we have a hybrid beneficial use of dredged material island that was built in Galveston Bay, and then something on the gray end, a flood wall in Greenbrook, New Jersey. So regarding the state of shorelines today, there's a range from green to gray. There was a study in 2015 by Gitman and colleagues that looked at aerial imagery and calculated that 14% of the U.S. shoreline is concrete. And NOAA's National Center for Coastal Ocean Science estimates that this will increase to 33% of the shoreline by the year 2100. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA are promoting a wide range of solutions to shoreline engineering, and they call this their Systems Approach to Geomorphic Engineering, or SAGE. And they have living shorelines included in this. You can see that in the upper left-hand side, and then it kind of starts to get to hybrid measures, eventually turning more gray, where you have your bulkheads and your levees in the lower right-hand corner. So although hardened structures are still an option, we're seeing a lot of different approaches to shoreline management. So I want to try and answer the question, why living shorelines? Why should we be considering living shorelines as one of our main approaches to shoreline management? This graphic comes from NOAA's Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, and it illustrates the difference between living shorelines and hardened structures. And really it's promoting living shorelines, so it's including a lot of advantages and benefits, including carbon reduction, sediment trapping, and I've highlighted a couple of the key features that I think are really key to living shorelines, including water quality and biodiversity. And then I've also highlighted the note that suggests that marshes can provide a reduction in wave heights, and we'll dig into that further in the presentation. But the point is that when you build a living shoreline, you get a lot of different benefits, whereas if you build a bulkhead, you're kind of doing it for one main purpose. So I think living shorelines provide us with a lot of wide ranges of opportunities to see benefits. Additionally, I think states are promoting this as well, and additionally, I think states are promoting living shorelines as well, and a very recent study by the National Wildlife Federation and the Coastal States Organization looked at what they're calling softening of the shoreline, and I took their data and made this little map to show all of the states in the Gulf and the Atlantic coast that are not just really promoting living shorelines, but say requiring them over some hardened approaches. And South Carolina is kind of a different color here because they have some regulations in the works but aren't quite there yet to that bright green stage. And even all the states that are colored gray, that doesn't mean that they're promoting hardened structures necessarily. They have a lot of options for pathways to allow living shorelines and green infrastructure on their coast. So a lot of states are maybe really already seeing the light before my groundbreaking presentation here, and they're paving the way to a green future. So what are the challenges for floodplain management? Living shorelines are great, but I do want to note a couple things that really need to be considered as a floodplain manager. The effectiveness of living shorelines decreases as storm surge increases. And we have a couple studies referenced here that show that although living shorelines have lots of great things about them, when you get to some of these large-scale events, large-scale regional erosion, river meandering, large tsunamis and waves and storm surges, their effectiveness is not found as much. And so if you're trying to protect against a 100-year or 500-year storm, it might not really be the best solution in some cases. Also, living shorelines can't be built everywhere. AECOM developed a GIS assessment tool for Prince George's County, Maryland, and their Department of the Environment to symbolize segments of the waterfront based on suitability for living shoreline projects. And the tool was developed to assist Prince George's County with their NDPES permit and obtain credits for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. But this would really apply in a lot of different cases. If your emphasis is erosion control or something else, you could use the same type of tool. It considers multiple variables, including fetch, shoreline ownership, cultural resources, and other parameters that are then converted into a numeric score, which is translated into a color system to help visualize which segments can most easily be converted into a living shoreline. But the point of this is that not every parcel of living shoreline or of shoreline can be converted into a living shoreline. We don't build living shorelines on an open ocean coast, and there's other places where it just might not work. So we need to consider that although they're very important and we want to put living shorelines where we can, it's not everywhere. Many studies have shown that marshes reduce flooding, but this is often associated with a large expanse of marsh. So a study published in 2009 by Ty Wamsley and colleagues showed that wave reduction rates were that they collected from measured data as well as modeled data in southern Louisiana found that wave reduction wasn't necessarily that straightforward. It depended on a lot of different criteria, including what the landscape looks like and the duration of storm that's coming in there, also other hurricane parameters. And they had some measured and modeled data that showed up to a meter reduction over areas with marshes that were as small as 5 or 6 kilometers, but there were other cases that required a much more extensive area of marsh to see that same reduction, and that's what's shown on the slide here. Some cases they needed 50 or 60 kilometers of shoreline, of marshes and living shoreline to see that 1 meter reduction. Another study I worked on with the South Carolina Department of Environmental Control for the Ocean and Coastal Management Division showed some analysis looking at marshes that were about 30 meters wide and finding that it had some localized reduction in waves, but it wasn't very widespread in some of these tidal, estuary, and riverine areas throughout the state. So I think it's understood that it does have some impact, but we don't want to overestimate the benefits of flood reduction and wave height reduction that you can see from a living shoreline. So how can living shorelines help? How can we apply them to floodplain management context, and how can we promote all the benefits that you get from living shorelines? Well, they have numerous benefits. So we talked about lowered wave heights, even if it's maybe not, even if you need a large expanse of shoreline. We've talked about decreased erosion. You see increased carbon sequestration, improved water quality, increased biodiversity. So if you're planning to put your living shoreline there to reduce erosion or for a floodplain management reason, you're going to get a lot of other benefits that come with it. And that's one of the great things about why you want to use a living shoreline if you can. Living shorelines frequently outperform structural measures. This was a little bit surprising to me, but there's some great studies out there, and this one I'm referencing here is from Carolyn Kern in NOAA, and she had a study that looked at the impact of Hurricane Irene on an island that had both living shoreline parts to it and bulkheads. And these pictures are showing you right after the storm. The living shoreline had some vertical bank erosion behind the marsh, but it didn't compare at all to the kind of substantial erosion that they were seeing behind the seawalls. So in cases where the surge is very small and it doesn't go over the bulkhead, you'll see some toe scour. But when there's larger surges and it goes over, the living shorelines seem to withstand a lot of that impact and can bounce back very quickly. But the bulkheads can often be destroyed or have a lot of erosion problems with them too. How do you get the most from a living shoreline? I'm going to propose a 3-step process here. You determine the main purpose. Why are you building it? You want to understand all the design constraints. And then finally, engineer it, build it, and maintain your living shoreline. First, determine your purpose. So is your main goal of the living shoreline to reduce erosion or get TMDL credits? Are you trying to do floodplain management and reduce some flood impacts? AECOM has worked on a lot of different options for innovative solutions, and I love this one here from a project in California that was part of a climate change and extreme weather pilot project for the San Francisco Bay Area. They designed a living levee, where the orange feature that's highlighted in this image is really the peak of the levee, but then on the seaward side they have a living feature that has vegetation, and it has an opportunity to provide some of those other living shoreline benefits that you see while getting up to an elevation that is going to provide a lot of substantial flood protection. So determine your purpose, know why you're building it, and keep that in mind throughout the process. You also need to understand your constraints. There are a lot of great tools available, and many of them are state specific and provide guidance to help design living shorelines. And my colleague Betsy Hicks is part of the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee, and she helped co-author their guidance document on living shorelines. This slide has an example showing the guidance on how to determine the longest fetch length for the project site, which determines the maximum wave heights that can be supported in this area and what your living shoreline is going to see. But there are other things to consider. What are the expected boat wakes? What's the salinity? Do you have access to beneficial use of dredged material to help build up the marsh? How do you do the construction? Do you want to consider a hybrid approach because of waves, such as you'd find out from this fetch analysis? Do you need to add oyster reef balls or core logs to reduce waves? So it's very important to understand your system and the constraints and help include that when you're designing your living shoreline. Finally, you want to engineer, build, and maintain. Even engineered projects that are built with care require maintenance and attention in those first few years. Inspecting the plants and taking care of areas that may have failed is a very common task, and it's an important part of keeping the living shoreline going until it's fully established. So making sure that that later part of the project is included in your total understanding of a living shoreline is important to making sure that you have a long-term success. The icing on the cake is that you can also claim CRS credits for several activities related to living shorelines. Activity 420 is related to natural shoreline protection, and you can get credits for adopting regulations that prohibit armoring. Activity 530 has a bunch of different parts related to flood protection, and if you can show that your living shoreline can protect against a 25-year flood, you can get a substantial amount of points for providing flood protection. So in conclusion, I hope that we can all work towards nature-based solutions, but I want to emphasize that we need to understand the limits. You have to determine the main purpose of why you're building this living shoreline and understand the design constraints. They can't be built everywhere. They may need to have a hybrid approach depending on your wave climate and other parameters. And finally, when you do engineer and build that structure, then you need to continue to maintain it and make sure you get the most usefulness out of the project. And hopefully we can see other great expanses like this Glen Martin National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland that's shown in this picture that has over 1,200 acres of tidal high marsh, submerged aquatic vegetation, and clam beds. And hopefully we can turn the tide on seeing more and more living shorelines where they're appropriate and where they help out, and see all those extra benefits that we can get from those in our communities. Thank you for your time today. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out and email me. And I'd love to hear about your projects and what you're doing in your communities to promote living shorelines and nature-based approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was great. Just thinking about living shorelines politically along the coast and even along riverine areas, what are some of the political resistance that you might find to a living shoreline, aside obviously from maybe cost to implement?
I think there are definitely some people that might not be as interested in the aesthetics of it. So, they might prefer something like a marina or something that's like a hardened shoreline, and that might be in their mind more what a shoreline looks like. And so I think there are some cases where you see like the natural grasses and the more natural based, it's a little sometimes harder to access the water. So I think there's some resistance there.
Okay. And you mentioned that you may not be able to build living shorelines on an open ocean coast, but what about oyster reefs? Are they counted as living shorelines?
Right. Yeah. I think I did have a graphic in there showing the Army Corps and NOAA had helped put together their like SAGE approach to looking at the different range of shoreline types. And, a full natural shoreline, maybe you could say that's really just grasses, that has to be a very low wave environment. But when you add some of those other features, like you mentioned, oyster reefs, or they'll have like a core log where you have a little bit of ability to break the waves offshore, then you can have the living shoreline feature just inland of that, upland a little bit. I would still consider that a living shoreline. I think that still counts. So it's, combining a couple different things to make that possible. You can have a higher wave environment when you do things like that.
Okay, great. And then Anna's asking, what are the background of professionals involved in these projects? Are they mainly engineers or also ecologists or biologists?
Yeah, so one project that we worked on, I live in Maryland, and we are working on a project I mentioned in Prince George's County, and we had a teamwork approach. So we had a coastal engineer that did the analysis of the wave heights and the fetch length and things like that. We had a team that was more involved in drafting. We wanted to get, you can do these kind of, I don't know, like, just have someone build them. But if you have a bigger team and you're building a bigger shoreline, then we had some people that were doing the drafting and designing the schematic for that. And we also did have a biologist side of that to better understand what kind of plants would fit into this environment. And we did have someone on our team who was more knowledgeable about the permitting aspects as well. So, if you have a bigger project, you can have different specialties involved. But I think, we heard some earlier today from the Nature Conservancy. They do a lot of great work on this and involve, their staff is very knowledgeable on designing these sorts of things too.
Okay. And Bobby asks, he says the National Climate Assessment states that sea levels could rise anywhere from 1 to 4 feet by the end of the century. Do you have an opinion on this range, as well as how could this potentially impact a living shoreline?
I'm going to answer the second question first. The impact of living shoreline as the seas rise means that the plants that are there get inundated more frequently and could be permanently inundated, and that can cause the marsh to die. So you have to have a place inland of it where the marsh can migrate. So as the waters increase, if you have land that the marsh can also kind of like creep up a very gentle slope, then that can help your living shoreline survive in the face of sea level rise. In terms of what's going to happen, I think it's very regional. And that you'd want to get some more guidance on what's happening, because there's also the combination of land subsidence, or in some cases like Alaska, there's rebound and the land's going up. But I think, I generally tend to promote sort of the middle range number, just because it's I think is reasonable for planning purposes, but I don't think it's the low end. We'll say that.
Okay. And Daryl asks, he says, in Ventura Point, California, there's a living shoreline project on the open coast. Would a beach dune restoration project be considered a living shoreline project?
I would consider that a nature-based approach, but I probably wouldn't call that a living shoreline. I would define it as a project that has particular kinds of planting and is designed to be inundated at a tidal level, sort of twice a day, well, depending on your tide range. But that's how I would define it. But there is a little bit of a range of definitions. I would define the project that Daryl is talking about more as like a nature-based approach.
Okay. And then Randy asks, is there information available to identify the maximum depth or wave height that some of the living shoreline features can handle? Maybe like a guide to certain kinds of shorelines that work well.
Yeah, I think there are some really great guidance documents out there. Virginia Institute of Marine Science, VIMS, has one of the first guidance documents that got put out. And that has a lot of good information about how to design things and what sort of wave your living shoreline can handle, and when you might want to do something that Joy suggested earlier of adding breakwater. Delaware has a great guidance document too. And there's also some tools. I know like the Nature Conservancy has their tool, and like I mentioned, one that AECOM had built for Prince George's County that help you understand a little bit more about what wavelengths and fetches can allow for a living shoreline. But definitely feel free to email me and I can send you some more resources too, if you're interested in getting started and seeing what will work for your community.
Okay, and then one last question from Kyle. He asks, are there any examples of shoreline applications for inland non-coast areas such as retention ponds, wetlands, or reservoirs?
I'm sure there are. It's beyond my level of expertise. So I'm a coastal person. You're not going to be dealing with the same, wave effects and things like that. Maybe you might have boat wakes, but you can email me and I'll do some digging and see what I can find and check in with some other colleagues that do restoration projects in the Midwest that I know, and I can send you more resources.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
This was a great session. Okay, so up next, the third part of our session is Brian Batten. He's a senior associate with Dewberry, and his session is titled Integrated Strategies for Resilience to Future Flooding in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Thank you, Brian.
Good afternoon. My name is Sue Kriebel, and I am the project manager for the Sea Level Wise for the City of Virginia Beach. Today, Dr. Brian Batten from Dewberry and myself are going to talk about the resilient strategies under consideration by City Council for the flooding in Virginia Beach. But let's start with a little background. A quick point of reference. The Commonwealth of Virginia is in the mid-Atlantic region of the country on the East Coast. The red dot is Virginia Beach. The city of Virginia Beach is located in the southwest corner of Virginia, and as you can see, we have a few water bodies surrounding the city. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the country, and it is to our north. To the south, the Southern Rivers watershed, which is part of the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound, the second largest estuary in the country, and we have the Atlantic Ocean to the east. And while we're known for our beaches, that is not all that Virginia Beach is. We have agriculture in the southern part of the city. We have our growing town center in the middle. We have natural areas such as West Neck Creek in the southern part of the city. We have boating in the Lynnhaven, which is an estuary that connects to the Chesapeake Bay. And we have Stumpy Lake, a large water reservoir within the southwest part of the city, but it is only for canoeing. It is a very shallow lake and no motorboats are allowed there. The city of Virginia Beach, it covers 310 square miles. It has 38 miles of shoreline along the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. This does not include any of the Back Bay or Southern Rivers watershed. There are 5 military installations within the city which support our local economy. We have a population of almost 500,000, and we keep growing every year. And now Brian is going to continue the program with a discussion on the hows and the whys of this project.
Thanks, Sue. This slide shows what we're going to cover for the rest of the presentation. We'll give a quick overview of the motivation and the process we use to carry out the study. We'll talk briefly about what sea level rise means in terms of a changing hazard and risk environment for the city of Virginia Beach, how they'll adapt to that future, and finally, we'll end up on a few examples of implementation successes and lessons learned. On the right of this slide, we see what's a flood call density map of the city of Virginia Beach. And basically, this is a heat map of when folks pick up their phone and call and complain about flooding in their yard, in their house, etc. And then on the left, we see several articles about flood issues and projects within the city. The city found that they were experiencing a growing number of issues, and they were identifying individual projects to deal with this, but they felt like they needed to step back and develop a strategic plan with priorities, and also that recognized the high rate of sea level rise in the Hampton Roads region, so that any projects they were undertaking would be designed to continue to function with future conditions and also inform future project land management, zoning, policy, planning decisions, etc. So the city engineer took these issues to City Council, and it led to the creation of a capital improvement program called the Comprehensive Sea Level Rise and Recurrent Flood Study, which is now known as Sea Level Wise. About the time that program started, the city received a questionnaire from Moody's, and these are some of the questions that were included in there. They get at, how much of the budget is the city spending towards these kind of projects? Are they budgeting for them? Are they recognizing them? Are they being proactive? Are they letting stuff happen? How might these issues affect the city's ability to pay back their loans? And, fortunately, the city had been thinking about this and had a great response, but also they took it very seriously because they have a AAA credit rating. They use that to borrow for their capital improvement projects, and they want to continue that in the future to maintain what they feel is the quality of life in the city of Virginia Beach. After the study started, There was a moment in 2016, or really the year of 2016, where several events happened that were important to the success of the study and how it's being taken by the city as a whole. And several heavy rainfall events occurred that year, some in succession of each other, and which made them worse. But in October of 2016, Hurricane Matthew struck the city with both some coastal storm surge, but more importantly, up to 1,000-year rainfall event in some areas. And that was followed by a minor flood event relatively in the southern watershed that flooded roads for several days. The culmination of these events, especially Hurricane Matthew, which damaged many homes in the center of the city, as you can see here, and also caused flooding in a relatively brand new high-end neighborhood in the city, really galvanized both public and political support that the city really needed to get a grip on the flood issues in the city and really be proactive about addressing them. The phases of our study, there's 4 of them, they're shown here. We started with what we call the impact assessment, and here we took a look and defined the sea level rise scenarios, other environmental factors, and what they meant to the flood hazards, created maps, looked at some other factors such as rainfall, and then used that information to quantify flood impacts in terms of economic flood loss at the building level to the city. Using that analysis, it informed our adaptation research, which focused not only on policy and planning measures, but nature-based features, flood defense infrastructure, community preparedness, and building level mitigation strategies. Those were pulled apart piece by piece so we could get through them. And then the last year of the study was kind of used to pull it all back together into an integrated framework. And then also, as Sue showed earlier in the presentation, we have these very diverse areas of the city of Virginia Beach. And we knew that although we had this framework and this catalog of strategies, we needed very specific applications of them across the city just because of its diverse nature. And so we created those as well. And today we're in phase 4, which is implementation. And that's really pushing these into the day-to-day actions of the city and planning for the larger pieces of it in the future. So now we'll switch to the changing hazard environment. And what does sea level rise and coastal flooding mean to the city of Virginia Beach? This slide shows flood pathways into the city with the 3-foot sea level rise, 100-year floodplain shown as well. As Sue said earlier, flooding comes into the city from all directions. And what's important also, it flows through other municipalities in terms of Norfolk and Chesapeake and other states, the state of North Carolina, to get to Virginia Beach. And that does cause some issues with certain types of strategy that the city may want to apply to reduce these impacts. In terms of sea level rise, the Hampton Roads region is just behind the state of Louisiana and Texas in terms of the rate of relative sea level rise in the United States. The stations in this part of Virginia are in the top 10%, and the rate of sea level rise is about 1.5 feet every 100 years. There's local gauge data and analysis done by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science that shows that there's acceleration evident in that gauge, and that the scenarios shown here, which are on NOAA's intermediate projection, are very likely to come true. So the city treats these kind of future conditions not as a what if, but they consider it as a fact and have accepted it and are planning for it. So as we take those future condition scenarios and look at what it means to coastal flooding, we want to look at several pieces of the puzzle. We want to look at not only daily flooding or weekly or monthly flooding in terms of high tides and nuisance flooding, but we want to look at the different probabilistic floodplains from the 10% annual chance condition to the 0.2% annual chance condition, the 500-year floodplain. And we can also produce information such as how flood frequency of these probabilistic flooding will change in the future, and map products to inform folks on what areas may be vulnerable in the future. Virginia Beach is a coastal city, and it experiences rainfall like many other places. To drain that rainfall out, it has to have a robust stormwater infrastructure. The city has over 43,000 drainage structures and 1,000 miles of pipe. When we look at what that means, right here is a coastal floodplain. We add the stormwater infrastructure, and now we see the additional flooding that could happen with rainfall backing up with that in a condition where coastal water levels are elevated. Another part of the puzzle we have to consider as well is what climate change means, not only to sea level rise, but increasing rainfall. Sometimes we forget to really think about this, so we need to see the whole picture. And we did look at that here and did some analysis both historically and on future projection data and regional climate models, and saw that heavy rainfall events, the trend that's just statistically significant is that their frequency is increasing, and the city will face more intense rainfall events in the future. Another factor is marsh loss. If we look back in time, we can see the city had much healthier, much more complete marshes in the past. And today they're fragmented a bit, and using our toolbox, we can see that in the future they'll fragment more, in some cases disappear. That's very important, especially in terms of this one process that pushes water up from North Carolina. These marshes put friction in the water column, and as they go away, the waters flow a little more freely. And some modeling shows that with that condition, these type of events can occur when the wind blows 1 or 2 days less, and they'll cause much more damage because, of course, there'll be deeper floodwaters occurring. So at the end of the day, we want to understand what this means in terms of economic loss. We're looking at two parts of that piece here on this slide. One is a geospatial map of the distribution of average annualized loss, which comes from a multi-frequency loss analysis at the building level using the HAZIS flood model and depth damage relationships. So we can take that individual building loss data and we can conflate it to a grid, and then we can see, hey, where in the city do we have loss and where are the hot spots? And that way we know where we need to focus strategy development on, especially looking at the future and how this loss will change. Where can we avoid it? The other thing we can do is we can summarize all this loss. We can aggregate it to the community level, and we can see what's at stake. Today, for example, in the city of Virginia Beach, we look to the right, the annualized loss in the city is about 26 million a year. We get to that 3-foot scenario, it's increased by about a factor of 12 times to 329 million a year. So this is what's at stake if the city does nothing. So it's a big change in their environment. It's definitely something they want to avoid, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. So what do we do about this? We don't want to be all gloom and doom. We want to see the opportunities here and what the city can do to avoid that scenario. And the first thing we want to emphasize is going back to that picture, that 12 times increase in flooding, is this statement by the city manager that they firmly believe that future loss, the cost of that will far exceed the cost of anything they do to mitigate it. So what can we do to get there? The overall strategy for the city has been pulled together, and it's in what's called the Sea Level Wise Adaptation Strategy. There's a report on this that synthesizes about 20 technical reports, 2,000 pages of very technical writing, but here it's presented in a very layperson-friendly story that kind of walks through the what, the why, and the how of what the city will do. We've talked a bit about that, the introduction and risk so far. So for the rest of the presentation, we'll kind of focus on the latter part of what this report shows. We know there's a complicated issue as sea level rise and flooding increases for the city, and there's no single solution that's going to address it. So what was done was we created 4 main themes for the adaptation plan that integrated natural mitigations, engineered defenses, structure adaptation, and prepared communities. We'll talk about each of these a little bit more as we go through the rest of the presentation, but we want to emphasize how will this get done, how it will get implemented. This leadership comes from the city, from the top to the bottom. They're of one mind on this, and they have a great effective mechanism and a working group led by a deputy city manager that has the heads of the different departments there, and these issues are discussed, the plans discussed, and it really facilitates implementation of it under the authority of that deputy city manager. If we pull all these parts and pieces together and show them on the map, we get kind of a complicated picture here. And we can see that there's other parts and pieces under those 4 themes, and there's even more as we drill deeper. And what we'll do now is kind of go through individual pieces of this just to show all that what was considered. And one thing to emphasize here too is there's many pieces that kind of overlay each other. So, you know, there are still decisions that have to be made. There's hard decisions that have to be made in some areas, whether to protect them, whether, you know, other approaches should be taken to mitigate that future loss. We'll start with natural mitigations, and here the different elements of this part of the adaptation strategy include everything from voluntary acquisition, so taking flood-prone areas, buying out the houses, and then converting them to open space or using them for other beneficial uses, to focusing development, strategic growth areas, and then using marsh restoration, especially in the southern watershed, as a tool to slow down water and perhaps mitigate some of those future conditions, along with beach nourishment and dune building around the perimeter shoreline. Engineered defenses, we looked at that 2 ways. First was a citywide approach. So here what we wanted to do was look at ways that we could intervene in those flood pathways and create a maximum amount of protection for the city. These are designed to withstand a 100-year flood with some contingency. And what's shown here, these different pieces protect up to 45,000 structures in the city. There are several different iterations of this and mixing the parts of the pieces that protect from the 20,000 to the 45,000. The cost for this kind of alternative is $2.4 billion. And that's a significant number. It does offer a significant amount of protection. It is cost beneficial, but it is a long-term project that's very expensive and requires engagement and a study by the Army Corps of Engineers to move forward. One thing we want to emphasize here through the benefit cost assessment is today, we talked about this earlier, this $26 million of annualized loss in a future condition that's so much higher. Even with this type of very large investment, it's very difficult to get down, and you can't even quite get there to today's levels of flood loss. So, you know, there may be some acceptance that in the future the city will have to live with a little bit more flood loss, or they'll adapt to it and try to mitigate that through other measures. The other part of the engineered defense strategies are what's termed the neighborhood alternatives. Diagram on the right, you see some hash lines. Those are areas we looked at that weren't as feasible for it, whether it was a lack of a good tie-in location or another project or other challenges. But 5 of these projects were identified, and these are, rather than protecting 20,000 to 40,000 structures, they protect maybe a few thousand structures all together, but they cost a lot less, from $15 to $70 million. So we're in the tens of millions instead of the billions. Much more feasible, but they're also designed to a lower level of protection and could be subject to overtopping and residual risks. So some of these are complementary to the citywide measures, some aren't. So again, another part of the decisions that have to be made. Adapted structures, through this element, we want to consider, hey, where can we use the floodplain ordinance to mitigate future losses in terms of increased freeboard, maybe extending existing floodplain ordinance out to the future floodplain so that we have freeboard in these future areas. So when the flooding gets to there, they're above those kind of conditions. Moving critical facilities out of the floodplain, of course, property tax relief as an incentive, and other structural strategies. And finally, we'll end in prepared communities, and this is looking at both education and promoting economic resilience. How do you do that? Looking at educating business owners, helping them understand their risk and develop strategies, and also, you know, elements such as coordinating with the, you know, significant military presence in the city, see how There's opportunities to come together to ensure that those service members' homes are not flooded, they're not impacted, they can get to work and maintain that strong economic base within the city. We have a diagram kind of breaking out the 4 key watersheds in the city, as we showed way back in the beginning, as to how different they are. We have riverine kind of watersheds to Chesapeake Bay watershed with a big estuary, to the resort ocean front, and the rural south with the large back bay environment. So each one of these places we have to look at a little differently as we apply those. And that was done, and it's broken out piece by piece in the plan. This is an example of it. And each of these elements under the themes are broken out one by one and kind of discussed. What's the application of it here? What are some of the details of that, the cost, the relative cost, the time frame for implementation, and the benefits of it, et cetera. Along the way of doing this, we had several checkpoints where we wanted to take the information out and present it to the public and really give them the opportunity to give us feedback rather than just telling them what we were doing. This was done in collaboration with social scientists at Old Dominion University, an outreach firm. And really, we were able to gather information from over 500 residents through a series of meetings and give them the opportunity to come out and talk to us and really gather a lot of great feedback that we use later in the report to, as we talk about each strategy, to really reflect what that public sentiment was. And sometimes it's good, and there's cases where it's bad too. But we include it in there because that should be told. And finally, we just a little bit about the plan. It's both a lengthy 300-page document, although it's pretty approachable from a layperson perspective. We also created an interactive story map that really provides a more accessible way to get through it, a more simpler way, and also opportunity to dynamically interact with some of the figures in there as GIS maps. In terms of integration of the outcomes of the study, the city has been in the process of pulling lessons learned, of pulling information into such things such as their master drainage study, stormwater master plan there. It's items such as the future rainfall condition, sea level rise tailwaters, looking at their transportation planning, ongoing projects, should they increase the design elevation to accommodate sea level rise. The plan was recently adopted into the comprehensive plan and will heavily inform the update of that's going on now, and many other items in the region and also to the state coastal plan that's underway. So we'll transition now to a few success stories in terms of implementation and a couple lessons learned that we think we wanted to share. One, increasing rainfall. Here, we told the story about Hurricane Matthew in the year of 2016, and that really, made the city stop and say, hey, is rainfall intensity changing? Are these isolated events? Are they statistical anomalies, or is it a trend? So we looked both historically and to the future. And again, we talked about earlier, there is a statistically valid trend, and it led to a suggestion, really a recommendation, that the city adopt a 20% increase in their design rainfall amount for their stormwater infrastructure. And under other parts of the study in the policy response report, and there's several goals under there and over 200 action items, under the action item to say, hey, we need to recognize some of these issues and make sure we're designing our critical infrastructure right. This information got propagated into the stormwater design, the public works design standards, along with increased tailwater conditions that accommodate sea level rise and some nonlinearity in that sea level rise, and also combined flooding conditions, accounting for the frequency which you do get rainfall and an elevated coastal water level at the same time. And we've received some recognition, cities received some recognition for their leadership in that. And in watershed scale modeling, we talked earlier about how these flood pathways, they come through adjacent municipalities and states. But also we have this complicated coastal city. It rains, and it can rain at the same time we have coastal flooding. And we look at structural solutions. We want to accommodate these different factors so we can make informed decisions. In the process of narrowing down over 10 combinations of placement of these citywide structural alternatives, we applied the DHI Mike modeling suite, which allowed us to integrate both the coastal flooding and rainfall-induced flooding, leveraging work from their master drainage study. So we could have integrated modeling at the same time, and we could see the impacts of having these structures in place, and also the flood benefits. So this map in green, we always say green is good. Those are reductions in floodplain and flood depths, and where you see the pink, that's where we're having adverse impacts. So in this case, building this flood defense alignment causes water levels to increase 2 to 4 inches. And that reaches down into the Carolinas a little bit, into the city of Chesapeake. So these are all pieces of the puzzle that have to be considered as the city works with these adjacent entities to forward this plan and works with the Corps of Engineers. How do these products inform decision making in the city, or has it? Has anything happened? Future floodplain maps, that's one of my pet things. I've done a lot of work in that area, especially for FEMA. We made several products of these here for the city, and they were socialized pretty well through many stakeholders in the city council and city management. And, you know, in 2018, there was consideration of a new development in a part of the city that is located in one of these areas that would be subject to future flooding. And one consideration of city council in evaluating that was that it was an area that was experiencing some flooding now, but also would experience much more flooding in the future. So city council unanimously decided to deny that development. Of course, the developer appealed, but fortunately the city won. And, you know, a great example of how this kind of product can inform land use planning and development, you know, to avoid that future risk. The last thing we'll touch on here is insurance policy penetration. We did several types of analysis of this with Sendeste. The key findings is this. One thing is looking at, you know, opportunities for policy penetration, increasing that in current conditions, but how it might change with these future conditions. And some key things we wanted to relate to the audience here was that, you know, as these conditions change the floodplain, we need to have products and purchase requirements, et cetera, that reflect that changing floodplain, that changing area risk, that communicate it, that can be used for actuarial purposes, or it will really result in an increasing residual risk for a gap in insured folks in the floodplain, and also just residual risk as a whole. So with that, we'll close. The website for this work is up top, and Sue and I's contact information in here, and we want to acknowledge NOAA's Regional Coastal Resilience Program for funding part of our study, and thank you very much for your time. We'll take questions. Thanks.
Wow, that's amazing work there. Thank you so much, Brian and Sue, for bringing that to us today. A lot of questions and a little bit of confusion, I think, on a lot of questions about quote unquote the report, which I take to be, at the time the questions came in, you were talking about the Dewberry assessment work, and then also questions that seem to be about this plan that the city has. So the biggest question is, how can people get their hands on these?
Yeah, on the last slide, there's a link to the CILO Rise webpage at the city's Public Works Department, and it has all the information there, a direct link to the report, the story map, and a lot of the other technical reports that serve as the foundation for what's explained in the overarching CILO Wise strategy report.
Okay, excellent. And one specific question, and I guess this fellow's just double checking. Matt asks, is the cost to do nothing an annual cost?
Yeah, that's correct. It's an annual average analyzed loss. It's was computed using the HAZUS flood loss model. We did a building level analysis for each of the 3 scenarios using a very custom approach, and have you leveraged that framework for a lot of benefit cost assessment for the different strategies that were evaluated as part of the study.
Okay. All right. And then Rod asked, do you know how many non-conforming pre-firm buildings there are in the V zone? He just, obviously you wouldn't have that number in your mind, but is that part of what's in the report, something like that?
I don't believe it is. Sue, I know you're on. Do you have an answer for that?
I do not. I don't think we separated that kind of building from the others. You know, I mean, we did residential, commercial, but we didn't separate that specifically into the V zone or the A&E zone or coastal.
Okay.
Yeah, Joy, the city has a CRS program. I'm sure they have a handle on those numbers, but it's not something that was, specifically addressed in what we were doing.
Yeah, and I know that the state floodplain manager can get that information from FEMA. They wouldn't necessarily know how many of the pre-firm buildings are non-conforming, but they could tell you how many pre-firm buildings there are in the V zone. So, Rod, you asked the question. You could contact the Virginia state floodplain manager, and they can get that for you. So. Let's see, let me look through. There's so many great responses to your work, the reports, the story map. Let's see. Here's some, Shana Yudvardi is asking, Brian, I'm curious if you've heard any conversations in Virginia Beach regarding holding the fossil fuel industry accountable to pay for sea level rise and other climate change impacts, similar to other cities such as San Francisco and New York.
That's a question I would pass to our city project manager, Sue Kriebel.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. There was some comments related to that when we put this out for public comment. We have not contacted any of them or determined which way we're headed with that yet.
Okay, very legal friendly answer. And then Anna asks, what is the main land use in the special flood hazard area? Considering that flood risk might increase significantly with future conditions, have you considered reclassifying high risk areas into land uses that are compatible with the flood hazard? Not exactly sure what she means by that.
Yeah, it's a complicated answer because of the city is so diverse across its 4 watersheds. So the main land use in each of the watershed that is vulnerable varies very much from agricultural to in the southern watershed to some dense residential in some other parts. We did use some strategies looking at refocusing development long-term in areas that are quote unquote high and dry, so outside the future 500-year floodplain, and tried to coincide that with the city's strategic growth areas. And there's also some strategies that look at voluntary acquisition of very flood-prone structures, and the city has started a new CIP to start exploring that a little bit further.
Okay. Great. I think we've combined some of these questions together into one. So I just want to, on behalf of the group who are flying through with their thanks here in the chat, saying things like great presentation, we want to thank you on behalf of ASFPM for doing this today. And then a final note for all of you that can hear me, don't forget there is another trivia night. So it starts at 5:30 Central Time. You'll want to grab your beverage and go to the events tab on the ASFPM website for that. And we'll see you later. Thanks.
All right, thanks.